Hi, this lecture is looking at ethnicity and differential achievement, and it's to follow a lecture you should have already watched, hopefully, looking at the external explanations for why there are gaps in achievement by ethnicity. So just to get started, I want you to think about one of the main arguments that was covered in that first lecture, which is the idea that the reason certain ethnic minority groups don't do well is because they are in some way culturally deprived. So this is what I describe as the cultural deprivation theorists. And they blame the gaps in achievement on the cultural backgrounds of the various ethnic groups, or what they actually mean is the lack of the correct culture. So obviously that could apply to a lack of certain norms, behaviours, a lot of lack of certain values for a variety of reasons. There are some links to family structure, a lack of the correct way of speaking, a lack of cultural awareness, lacking the right cultural capital, as well as perhaps just not being able to access the mainstream culture because of the way they've been socialised culturally as well. So what ideas and concepts can you recall from that initial lecture to support this argument, ideally without looking at your notes? So how many things can you recall? And then I would like you to try to evaluate cultural deprivation theorists. Like, how can we disagree with them? What other points of view are there? What other causes or explanations are there for the gaps, if you like? And any concepts you can remember from the evaluation section of that lecture. So pause this slide now and have a go and just see what you can recall. So I'd like you to have a go at applying what you've learned from that first lecture to these sort of up-to-date statistics, if you like. This data is the Attainment 8 scores are from 2018. This is when they take the GCSE scores of each student and they turn them into a percentage, if you like. So the average for students that year in 2018 was a 46.5 percentage scoring. And if you have a physical copy of this graph, you might want to draw a dotted line where that might be, so you can clearly see which ethnic groups are above or below that average. So I'm going to ask you to try and explain as much as you can think, as many of these gaps are both above and below average, and how they connect to the three main explanations that were covered in that first lecture, which is cultural deprivation, there's lots of stuff, material deprivation, there's a few concepts there, and finally looking at racism in wider society, sort of the prejudices and stereotypes held in wider society, particularly the workplace. So in case you are feeling a bit flummoxed, I have given you a list of concepts and ideas to apply. Just remember, at the moment, we're just looking at external explanations. However, of course, you can use things that go on in school to evaluate some of these. So if you are aware of them or you can think of any, feel free to add them in as evaluation. That's always good to have on here. I'd recommend doing this either in the middle of an A3 sheet or A4 sheet. So you've got enough room to write about each of these concepts and how they can explain why some groups are doing better than others. So I'll just read some of these, by the way, you might not have come across in that lecture, but I will talk to you about. So external concepts to apply: restricted speech, a lack of intellectual stimulation, so that's very much linked to socialisation, a fatalistic attitude, lone parent families, male role models, a cycle of dysfunction, slavery, badge of victimhood. That's one of those ones that you won't have come across in the previous lecture, but I'll be interested to know if any of you are aware of it. High aspirations, supportive parents, experience of colonialism, the idea that university is there for social mobility, so to move upwards through the class ranks. Street culture, now which groups does that apply to? Because I think it applies to more than just one ethnic group. Substandard housing, material deprivation, discrimination, social exclusion, and unemployment. Okay. Just in terms of the badge of victimhood, I will talk to you about that briefly now, actually. This is the idea, and it's from research from Tony Sewell that we'll look at in a bit more detail when we look at the processes going on in school. But he found that culturally, many black students or many black people viewed their race as something that they were victim of, like being black was something that was negative about them, that meant that they were going to be suffer in some way or going to have less opportunities than perhaps someone who was white. The idea that it was better to be white. So I won't say much more about that, but just have a think about what impact do you think that would have, that view that your own ethnicity, your own skin colour is something you're a victim of. What impact do you think that could possibly have on achievement? Quite a significant one, if you like. So this is the main activity for this lecture, getting you to apply what you've learned from the other lecture to up-to-date data. It would be interesting if you spot anything in this data set that disagrees with that previous lecture, okay, that disagrees or challenges or maybe one group's doing better than perhaps you would have expected based on what we learned from the other lecture. The ones in bold, that's like the average for that whole ethnic group. So Asian is in the dark blue, bold. And then within there, you've got Bangladeshi, Indian, Pakistani, Asian, other. Then you've got black, and then that's again broken up. Interestingly, Chinese has its own separate category, probably because their achievement rates are exceptional compared to many of the other ethnic minority groups, or ethnic groups, sorry. Whereas, obviously, geographically, China is clearly part of Asia, but they've done that separately. They've done China as a separate category. Then you've got mixed, white, and other. Okay, so pause this lecture now. And I just want to highlight the achievement levels of the Gypsy, Roma and Irish traveller community and have a think about perhaps what's causing those, because that isn't covered explicitly in that first lecture that I've asked you to watch. So pause this now. Hopefully you've got a copy of this graph, and if you haven't, you can just make some notes on this on line paper, for example. That'd be great. So as well as all the annotations and explanations that you've done already, these are some of the takeaway figures I think that are useful. And again, I've shamelessly nicked these from the website when I got the graph from. So again, the average is 46.5. White Pakistani, black African children, very close to the national average. And Bangladeshi's children are 3% higher. So we don't really need to kind of go into any detailed explanation about any variation because they're all relatively close to the average. However, what is interesting is Chinese children are 18% higher than the national average. So why is that? Okay, hopefully you can and you have annotated on your graph why that is. Indian children 10% higher, whereas black Caribbean children underachieve by 7 points. So that's black Caribbean, which is different to, if you like, the average for which is different to black African. And then, like I mentioned before, Irish Traveller and Gypsy Roma have the worst underachievement levels on that graph. And what is it about that community that leads to underachievement? It's not just material deprivation, lack of money. There's something else going on within that community, or the perception of that community, that perhaps might explain that underachievement. So please annotate your ideas onto your graph or whatever notes you might be making at this point. I just wanted to highlight this other graph as well that looks at the difference in by free school meals and ethnicity. So the dark blue for each ethnic group are those that are on free school meals, which is an indicator of working class. And the light blue are those from that ethnic group that are not on free school meals. So class clearly has a significant effect on all ethnic groups, and that is a point that you should be making in any essay really about ethnicity and achievement, that class perhaps has more of a impact perhaps in ethnicity. However, when you get a group that is perhaps, I don't know, working class and black, then those two categories, those two areas are going to have a double whammy on that individual in terms of their educational achievement and other issues as well when we look at other topics. So, for example, black working class do less well than black middle class. White working class achieve the lowest, followed by mixed race and then black. So this perception that it's black students we need to be worried about is perhaps not entirely accurate. It's actually the white working class that perhaps we need to be a little bit more concerned about. However, all of those groups, black, mixed and white, are doing significantly poorer than average. So we need to be worried about all three. And Chinese working class do significantly above average. So that seems to suggest that the explanation of material deprivation causing underachievement doesn't seem to apply to that group. Why is that? Why even do working class Chinese students outperform not just other working class students, but other middle class students as well. So what is going on in that community? Or is it the community, or is it schools? Or, what is the explanation for why that group does so well? So again, have a quick pause here and add in some of your ideas. So the final activity for you guys to do is to apply what you've learned and write about it in an extended way. I'd like you to start off by ranking cultural deprivation, material deprivation, and racism in wider society in order of which one you think is the most significant in terms of leading to underachievement of certain ethnic groups, and to least. And just a quick reminder there that in terms of the ones that don't do so well, it's sort of the white working class, and within that is of course the traveller community, and the black community. It's in particular the black Caribbean community. I should have written there, not just black. So yeah, pick the one that you think is the most significant, has the strongest explanation for why one of those groups or all of those groups are not doing so well, and actually a different one might apply for different groups. And then all the way down to the one that you think has the least effect. Doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect, it just has slightly less of an effect than the other two that you've picked. And then here's the fun bit. I'd like you to write a paragraph, an analytical paragraph about each of the above causes, and explain why that causes underachievement of those groups, but also explain in an evaluative way why that point is either stronger or weaker than the other two. Okay, so you should be doing 3 paragraphs. You might start off writing about the one that you think is the most significant, and in there you'll explain the idea, but then also explain and evaluate why it's stronger than the other two. Then you might write about your second strongest argument, explain why it's slightly weaker than the first, but stronger than the third. And then you'll write your final point, which again isn't saying it's an irrelevant concept. It still definitely has an effect, but you will explain why perhaps it's slightly weaker than the other two. So 3 detailed paragraphs who will naturally be linked in a chain of reasoning because you're explaining why one or the other is stronger or weaker than the others that you've written. And if I have you in class, I'll look forward to checking that next time I see you. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.